Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden, and it is mid-July. Everything is so productive. I've been harvesting loads of peas, both sugar snap and also garden peas, and lots of courgettes, beetroot, potatoes, beans. It's absolutely amazing. And I'm just here at one of the flower borders, just about to start cutting the first of the cosmos and also of the cornflower as kind of the first batch of cut flowers from the garden this year. And I'm growing a lot more because it's a great way to bring in some beneficial insects and just add a little bit more colour. And the reason why I'm doing this is because this year I've taken a completely different approach to growing food. Usually I'd create a garden plan, and that would then morph into a month-by-month planting plan, so I knew exactly what would be happening at any given stage and have a solid idea. But this year I decided to completely change that around and explore intuitive gardening. The big question is, what is intuitive gardening? Well, you can label it as no rules vegetable gardening, and rather than following a set garden planting plan, what you do instead is throw all of that out of the window and garden just based on what feels right. You know, what time of year is it? Is there a big enough space to fit something in? It's almost throwing out all of the rules and just dabbling with what you personally feels best for a given space. A lot of fun and excitement comes from gardening when we have the freedom to test and trial and experiment with different things. And I thought, what could be the biggest experiment than throwing away the month-by-month planting plan that I used to do and really go into the deep end with intuitive gardening and start from a blank canvas. And I will admit that it has definitely been a learning curve, but it's also been a lot of fun because I found myself doing things that I never really used to do, but also working out really important lessons that perhaps I would never have learnt had I stuck to a month-by-month plan. I've been really inspired by the gardening that Liz from By the Farm has been doing, and also Susan from Shetland, when I went there to film about her growing in polycrobs. And so I thought this year I'd like to try a bit with intuitive gardening, and I'd like to invite Liz to do the main part of this video, which is to show you how she does intuitive or instinctive gardening and the reasons behind that.
There is so much information available in books and online and word of mouth about gardening, and it's really hard to know which pieces of advice are to take and which not. What happens if we ignore the should be done and start thinking about what could be possible? I think when we were very young and at school, most of us will have learnt how to grow something. We'll have put a bean into a jar and watched it grow, or we'd have grown cress by putting mustard and cress seeds either on tissue paper or in an empty eggshell with a little cotton wool in it, and seen how it grows. And we learn that those basic rules of biology apply to almost all seeds. So we know that for a plant to grow, it's going to need some seed and some water and the right temperature, and eventually it'll produce some sort of flower to enable it to reproduce, and it will form seeds of some sort. So there are these basic biological laws. If we use those laws, if we learn them and understand them, all the other rules don't necessarily have to apply. One of the things that Hugh and I have been talking about is about just gardening instinctively and gardening with an understanding of how plants work without the fear of getting it wrong. If we give ourselves permission to experiment and to not be too rigid in following rules, all sorts of wonderful things might happen. I grow a run of beans every year, and I put the seeds into some soil, either direct into the ground or in some compost in trays. But the other thing I do is I allow them to grow back. So it was a really nice coincidence that I had just left the plants in the ground over winter. I had cut them off, but I hadn't dug them up. I was thinking something about nitrogen fixing or something like that. I wasn't really thinking it through terribly much. And then the next year, they grew back. So now each year I grow a few by seed to pop into the ground, and they'll send up one shoot out of the seed, and up they go. These plants are now on their third year in exactly the same spot, and because I haven't followed the rules and dug up all the roots, I now have really strong, healthy plants that come back each year. Out of the 21 plants that I put in against these canes, I think there are 4 that come back each year, but I'll take that. I'm really pleased I didn't follow the gardening rules with these runner beans. When I first started gardening back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, I read all the books that I could get hold of at the time, and I learnt all about spacing of plants and how much room to give them and all the conventional wisdom of the time. And then as the years have gone on, I've experimented, I've set that information aside and said, well, what else can I do? And now I don't worry about following those spacing rules. I plant much more with my instinct. I kind of think about how big is a plant at the end and how much could it cope with having plants next to it. I'm not growing these plants to have the maximum yield and the biggest, shiniest, most uniform vegetables that there are. I'm feeding my family. We don't mind if our vegetables are a bit wonky and the carrots aren't straight and the beetroots aren't really round because they've got a squishy bit on one side of them. And I don't worry if things like my leeks sit in the seed bed for a little bit too long and they get bigger than they might do before I transplant them, because I'm working with the time I have and the resources that I have, and I'm not beating myself up if I don't do it exactly like the book says I should. Because it turns out that the plants haven't read those rule books. They haven't read that they should grow to a certain size or a certain spread. All they want to do is grow. Nature has this amazing capacity to just want to reproduce itself all the time. And the advantage for us is that we usually want to eat the very parts of a plant that it uses to reproduce. This lovely artichoke was planted completely in the wrong place. I put it in the ground and just off it's gone. And I know I often say that, but I really don't do an awful lot to the plants here. I let nature take its course and the plants to do their own thing, and I just celebrate if we manage to get some lovely food from it. When we decorate our homes, we buy ornaments or wallpaper or paint that reflect our tastes and our personalities. So why wouldn't we do the same in our garden? And there's such an amazing array of plants that we can choose from. The Angelica over there, which I love. I love its exuberance and its architectural. Look at me! It's actually, the flowers are just these creamy green colour. It produces masses of seeds. And convention says I should be removing these seed heads and maybe just saving a few of the seeds and stopping it from spreading itself everywhere. But why would I do that when nature wouldn't? Now don't get me wrong, I do plant things in neat straight rows like these squashes, but I also know that I'm going to be interplanting them with some cosmos to change up the mix so there isn't just a monoculture here. I'll be putting some flowers in. I'm also going to put some late brassicas in here because I know that once these squashes have died down in the autumn and disappeared in the winter, that this space can be used for growing purple sprouting broccoli. I'm not just going to put some purple sprouting broccoli in here, I'm also going to add some perennial plants to the mix. So there will be some perennial kale and some perennial broccoli, and I might, I'm thinking about it, but I think I might add some more currant bushes in here, so that over time, when I've taken up the plastic, put a really good mulch layer over here, this will become part of our food forest. When I stopped thinking about the garden as separate compartments with fruit and vegetables on one side and ornamentals on another and a lawn somewhere else, things suddenly opened up. So these roses on each side of this arch are no longer just ornamentals. I harvest the hips for wine and for jelly. So these are now part of our productive garden. And the lawn is no longer a place where just grass grows, although we let that grow too. It's a place full of clover. I leave the clover for the bees to forage from, and then we have a clover infused honey. So I don't try and fight those basic biological rules, and I know some plants are better off grown inside and protected than outside in the elements here in Wales. But with plants like tomatoes, I start off with the conventional wisdom of removing all the side shoots on indeterminate tomatoes, so those ones that just keep on growing. And once I've made sure that there is plenty of air circulating at the lower levels of the tomato plants, so that they're less prone to blight and fungal infections, in late summer I just let all the side shoots grow and just let the plants go wild, because once I've started harvesting from the plants, well, nature knows what she's doing. She wants to produce as many seeds as possible, and that's as many tomatoes as possible. What I'm really trying to say is that understand the biological laws, understand exactly what it is that plants need to grow healthily and to grow well, and then give yourself the permission and the freedom to experiment a little bit with exactly how you put those plants together, what you grow together. And all the time I'm learning new things. This year I learnt that growing alliums like onions and garlics with beans is not a good idea. Not because somebody decided that it's not a good idea, but because research shows that there is a chemical compound in alliums that has a detrimental effect on the growth of beans. Well, now I know that, I won't do it again. Well, maybe I will, but I'll be aware that the bean crop might not be as good as I'd like it to. This style of gardening won't be for everybody. If you feel the need for really neat and straight lines, the chaos of a wildlife garden in a food forest might not work for you. But if you do have a bit of space that you can just let grow a bit, plant up with fruits and vegetables that will come back year after year, things like this lovely bronze fennel, and there's some lemon balm that's seeded itself here. There is something very lovely about being able to wander around the area and pick up raspberries and tayberries and take in fresh herbs, and all the while knowing that the area is teeming with wildlife.
I just want to say a huge thank you to Liz for starting off this series where I'm exploring more about intuitive gardening. And when I mean series, there'll be just a few more videos where I'll explore this in more detail, including a final conclusion for this year on how I found it, as well as tips on how to get started or what to consider if you also are potentially thinking about going down the route of intuitive gardening and no rules gardening. But I think the summary at the end of the year, which has the positives and also the negatives, is going to be really fascinating. If in the meantime you're interested in finding more about intuitive gardening and also other things to do with this garden, then I'd love to invite you over to my Patreon page, where I upload 2 exclusive videos about vegetable gardening every single week, and it would be great to see you there. So thank you for watching, and don't forget to go over and say hello and subscribe to Liz if you haven't done so already, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.